Today at the National Press Club, Mutati woman Fiona Cornforth from the Healing Foundation, calling for action to help stolen generation survivors heal from trauma. The Foundation's latest report urges governments to use the strengths of First Nations cultures to help with intergenerational healing. Fiona Cornforth with today's National Press Club address.
Yuma. Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. I'm Misha Schubert, a Vice President of the club, and I've had an abiding interest in Indigenous policy throughout my life and reporting career. We begin today by grounding ourselves rightly in time and place, and of course in the long story of this country, and for the continuous 65,000 plus years of history, culture, language and law that span of history represents. Today we bring you a very powerful event. This week, of course, is National Reconciliation Week, bookended by two major dates in this country's history, the anniversaries of the 1967 referendum and the Mabo decision of the High Court. And last Wednesday marked the 24th anniversary of the tabling of the Bringing Them Home report, the detailed evidence gathering of what had happened to the stolen generations in our country. So today, the Healing Foundation CEO Fiona Cornforth, a Wuthathi and Torres Strait Islander woman, will share some crucial new data about the vast continuing challenges faced by stolen generations people and their descendants. And then we'll move into a panel discussion with Fiona, Yorta Yorta man Ian Hamm, and Wiradjuri man Harry Williams, whose grandfather's generation bore the brunt of some of these policies in New South Wales. And we want to acknowledge particularly the elders in this room and across the country and pay thanks and tribute to your continuing leadership role and the crucial cultural leadership that you offer our communities across the country. If you'd like to join the conversation online, please do. Use our hashtag PressClub @PressClubAUST and the hashtag NPC. And if this discussion raises issues for you and you need support, please know that you can call Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline on 131114. So would you please welcome to the podium Fiona Cornforth.
Thank you, Misha. Good afternoon. Thank you to the National Press Club for the chance to speak here today at such a highly respected venue. To give voice to the experiences, the needs and the views of stolen generation survivors, their families and communities is an enormous responsibility, and I'm grateful for the faith shown in me to do this day. I acknowledge and pay my deep respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to the traditional custodians and owners who care for this country so it can care for us. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I thank them for welcoming my family onto this country. I give thanks for my elders, and I acknowledge ballas, sissies, aunts and uncles and families and networks that sustain us. I acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Nations peoples here and around the country and further afar, watching or listening to the broadcast. I also acknowledge non-First Nations peoples who walk and work alongside us with respect as they unlearn, learn and relearn through our stories and experiences. I thank and welcome the wonderful Ian Hamm and Harry Williams, who share their journeys with us so generously to guide healing. And I pay my respects to all those stolen who lead the call for intergenerational healing in our nation, made up of many nations. The Healing Foundation provides a national platform to amplify the voices and the experiences of stolen generation survivors, their families and descendants. We walk beside survivors as they lead healing journeys, and our work seeks to honour all our ancestors by making future generations stronger and more free from trauma experiences and free to lead fulfilled lives, fulfilled, well and prosperous lives. First Nations peoples must be afforded the opportunity to recover from the trauma arising from colonisation, brutal past government assimilation policies, and ongoing systemic racism. Stolen children lost connection to safe, loving and nurturing families, to land, culture and language, and were taken to homes and institutions where they were often abused, neglected and unloved. Mothers, fathers, families and communities left behind also suffered terribly. The removal of children creates cycles of intergenerational trauma, which has not been widely acknowledged, let alone addressed or resolved. Impacts and experiences of traumatic events and interactions with government representatives, with institutions and systems that punished our families continue to, with their origins in acts of colonising and oppression. Today, Ian, Harry and I turn your attention to the case for long overdue healing, a case for healing this nation of many nations, which begins with the stolen generation survivors and their families. We make a case for ending cycles of trauma experiences, a case for intergenerational healing. We know that our cultures, the First Nations peoples, our cultures as First Nation peoples, such as our connections to country and our deep family ties, made us strong over millennia and continue to be our strength. When children are systematically taken from family and community over many decades, these connections are severed for a time, and for many, never restored. Stolen generations have endured a lifetime of trauma, grief and loss. We know a significant burden is on them of poorer health, well-being, social and economic outcomes, and it's experienced by this proportion of our peoples as a result. This cohort of our population are growing older, and many live with disabilities and complex health problems, with mostly systemic barriers to accessing services. Stolen generations are worried about the future of their families. Still. It's been 24 years since the Bringing Them Home report laid out the wrongs that needed to be righted and a clear roadmap for addressing impacts. I think about the late Carol Kendall, a blanket baby stolen at birth, who chaired the Stolen Generations Working Group in 1997 and courageously partnered with Sir Ronald Wilson to form a National Sorry Day Committee which pushed for the full implementation of Bringing Them Home's recommendations. I think about Sir Ronald Wilson, who led the inquiry back then, who spoke at this podium on the 24th of March in 1998 on the importance of observing a Sorry Day. And the first one was held 2 months later. I acknowledge all the leaders who began the journey of healing movement in 1998, delivering unprecedented engagement of the wider population in signing sorry books, walking over bridges, and unveiling memorial plaques for truth-telling on institution sites. I wear a lapel pin with the movement's logo, which Aunty Carol Kendall created. It's a white foot and a black foot and a sunrise, which expressed a joint venture in us all coming together to work for a new day. It represents the start of the journey of healing and a journey that continues. Our Make Healing Happen artwork also contains a sunrise. It's to symbolise that half-done job, that unfinished business. I pay tribute to the warriors who were at the beginning and are still here fighting, some of them now in Parliament, and gratefully some of them are on the Healing Foundation's board and on our Stolen Generations reference group. They inspire a dedicated Healing Foundation team and a youth reference group, and we are thankful for their guiding expertise. Since the Bringing Them Home report, in the time another generation has joined us, we are yet to see any significant national approach to healing for stolen generation survivors and their families. We've seen underfunded Aboriginal community-controlled organisations undertake the heavy lifting for support services, and very little expectation put on the broader and better funded service sectors to understand the extent of trauma experiences across generations and to contribute to healing. Many stolen children have already passed on to the dreaming without reparations for the harm they experienced and for the effects on their descendants. We must not delay justice for stolen generations for the time that another generation joins us. We must not wait a moment longer. Those still with us are ageing. By next year, all will be aged over 50. We know with certainty now that unless we address the impact of trauma carried across generations, efforts to close gaps will be compromised. We will not achieve our national aspirations for closing the gap without addressing the barrier of trauma experiences for what is too significant a number of our population. Today, the Healing Foundation is releasing this new significant report, Make Healing Happen, It's Time to Act. The report provides in-depth insight into the experience of stolen generation survivors and the extent and complexity of their needs now and as they grow older. It considers the impact of forced removal on stolen generations' descendants, drawing on analysis undertaken by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. A companion publication, the AIHW's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Stolen Generations aged 50 and over, an updated analysis for 2018 and 19, I believe is also being released today. The Make Healing Happen report also used analysis of 2 decades of testimony from stolen generations and their families to a variety of parliamentary and other inquiries. A key but unsurprising finding from these analyses is that stolen generation survivors and their descendants carry higher levels of disadvantage across life outcomes compared to the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were already carrying disadvantage in comparison to non-First Nations peoples. So there is a gap within the gap for each and every outcome. The AIHW report has now published the extent to which this extra gap stems from removal, and removal alone. Stolen generation survivors have multiple, complex and overlapping needs which are largely unmet. Their health and well-being are significantly worse off than that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of a similar age who were not removed. Compared to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the same age, stolen generation survivors aged 50 and over are more likely to be living in tough economic circumstances. They are 1.8 times as likely to not own a home, and this is 4.1 times compared to the non-Indigenous population. 1.5 times as likely to have government payments as their main source of income. And this is 2.2 times compared to the non-Indigenous population. Compared to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of the same age, they are more likely to be living with health and other stresses. They are 1.7 times as likely to have experienced discrimination, 1.5 times as likely to have experienced actual or threatened physical violence, 1.4 times as likely to be living with a severe disability, and this is 3 times compared to the non-Indigenous population, and 1.4 times as likely to have poor mental health, 2.7 compared to the non-Indigenous population. Compared with general non-First Nations population, stolen generation survivors aged 50 and over are over 4.5 times as likely to have kidney disease, over 3 times as likely to have diabetes, and 2.7 times as likely to have heart, stroke and vascular disease. The AIHW estimates that in 2018-19 there was an estimated 33,600 survivors, including 27,200 aged 50 and over. Those 50 years and over, in that 27,200, this comprises 1 in 5 or 21% of First Nations people in that age group. When you drill down, the numbers become more compelling. In Western Australia, for example, a third of the surviving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population born before 1972 were removed as children. And stolen generation survivors, as I said, are growing older. 80% of survivors were aged 50 and over. By 2022, next year, all will be at least 50 and eligible for aged care. Nationally, more than 1/3, so 36% of adult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are descended from older generations who were removed. Great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, aunties and uncles. There are over 142,000 descendants nationally, with the number growing over time. In some jurisdictions, like Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia and the ACT, between 40% and 60% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults are descended from stolen generation survivors. So this is a very significant percentage of our populations across Australia. It signals the need for a radical rethink and reform in key policy areas such as aged care, such as health and mental health, disability, welfare, social justice and housing for stolen generation survivors and their descendants. And we know descendants of stolen generation survivors also experience significantly poorer well-being when compared to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Adverse experiences in childhood can have lifelong effects. Traumatic childhood experiences such as those of stolen generation survivors may affect following generations through biological changes in stress responses and by undermining survivors' ability to function from a place of strength, maximising the broadest range of opportunities and possibilities. Intergenerational trauma is real, and we have the evidence in support of the testimonies. AIHW found that compared with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adult descendants of stolen generations are 2 times as likely to feel discriminated against in the past year, almost 2 times as likely to have experienced actual or threatened violence in the past year, 1.5 times as likely not to have good health, to have been arrested in the past 5 years, and to have been formally charged by police. Among the total adult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations in each state and territory, the Australian Capital Territory had the highest proportion who were descendants, 61%, followed by WA with 55.6%, South Australia with 47.8%, and Victoria with 41.5%. The disruption to families, cultures, connections, and the current extra burden of restoration up against inequality, it takes its toll. The evidence is clear. Removal is the origin of trauma for too many of our peoples, yet it is simply not considered or accounted for in policy, in funding decisions, or service delivery. Intergenerational trauma can end, though, through intergenerational healing, and we have got to get on with this first thing first. Healing enables peoples to overcome trauma and to restore well-being. It allows people to act from a place of strength more often than a place of distress. Healing is about restoring well-being, a strength of spirit, family connections and law, custom and protocols that have made Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures the oldest living cultures on the earth. Effective ways stolen generation survivors and their descendants are supported to heal include that reconnecting with cultures, strengthening belonging and identity, restoring safe and enduring relationships, supporting communities to understand the impacts of their trauma experiences on life outcomes and choices, and communities creating and leading trauma-informed change. For stolen generations, healing also means keeping children safe with family and addressing the rates of out-of-home care and juvenile detention. The way systems operate, the way they were designed to operate, undermine healing journeys. Without an understanding of how our peoples experience trauma, our interactions with these systems delay, set back, and compromise healing for our peoples. The Uluru Statement and the process to develop it through national dialogues included the voices of many survivors and their family members. Voice, treaty and truth is considered fundamental to healing, and the absence of these are referred to as the reasons why survivors and their families are not heard and do not have power to influence urgent action, let alone benefit from any of those actions. Healing is also at the core of the work the Healing Foundation does with the Coalition of Peaks and our national agreement with governments to close the gaps. System reform is critical, and this new way of working closely with people in the know, our peak bodies, will help us bring about these reforms as quickly as possible. Today, we make known statistics and evidence of the extent of the challenges facing stolen generation survivors and their descendants. In the face of these challenges, though, you should know this. Stolen generation survivors lead the intergenerational healing movement, which began as the journey of healing. In the course of us working alongside survivors to ensure stories and the evidence are seen together, they led the design and launch of a Stolen Generation Schools Resource Kit, and in under a year it had 13,000 downloads, and this is in addition to a mail-out of hard copy kits to all 10,000 odd schools nationwide. Stolen Generation survivors lead building young people's capacity early to understand truth and healing, and it is having an amazing impact on school communities. Also guided by survivors was the development and distribution of Stolen Generations fact sheets on providing effective care to them. This was done with and for the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, the Australian Dental Association, and the Aged and Community Services Australia, and the Aged Care Industry Association. These were launched by Minister Ken Wyatt in December 2019 at Parliament House, and there is a list of 17 other bodies Stolen Generations deem to also require fact sheets. Stolen Generations also lead in this way. The AIHW estimates that children living in a household with Stolen Generation survivors are 2 times more likely to identify with clan, tribal or language groups, and 2 times more likely to recognise a homeland. For the protection, the well-being, for the strength and identity of descendants, survivors are leading healing, and against all odds, against barriers many of us can only imagine. They show us that there is practical, achievable and affordable recommendations that fall out of this evidence for us as a nation to make a real and lasting difference to their lives and to the lives of their future generations. Finally, and after all this time. So the Healing Foundation has made a start on some, as mentioned. If the report's recommendations are adopted completely, it will also fulfil the aspirations of the 1997 Bringing Them Home report. We recommend firstly that there be redress for stolen generation survivors and their descendants. All Australian governments, in collaboration with stolen generation survivors, must co-design a universal, safe, culturally appropriate and trauma-aware and healing-informed redress scheme for living and deceased stolen generation survivors and their descendants. This includes the Australian Government urgently addressing reparations for stolen generation survivors removed in Commonwealth territories. All governments must establish a funding stream for investing in healing. The funds would be used to expand support and resources for stolen generations organisations and other organisations nominated by stolen generation survivors to deliver healing programs focused on the specific needs of them and their families. Secondly, to meet the complex needs of stolen generation survivors, all governments must resource programs and policies across Australia that are co-developed with stolen generation survivors to holistically address these specific needs, with priority placed on aged care, disability, health and housing. Trauma-aware and healing-informed approaches must be embedded in all aspects of systems that engage with and impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Trauma is a human experience. It can be managed well and it can be overcome. We see in the report that unique to our experience is that our cultures heal. When we restore aspects of our cultures that keep us safe and well, we are better able to heal. When programs and services, sectors and workforces are trauma-aware and healing-informed, stolen generation survivors are better able to live their lives from that place of strength and design their own success as they freely choose. 3, to end intergenerational trauma and prevent new harm, all governments must resource and implement a national intergenerational healing strategy to address intergenerational trauma. The strategy should include investments in truth-telling, self-determination, healing through culture, systems reform and improvements at policy, program and workforce levels. Community-led services and programs. Capacity building for communities and other stakeholders to recognise and address trauma. Collective and family healing. Continued reform in access to records by stolen generation survivors and descendants. And consolidation, application and building of a healing evidence base. Collective healing programs co-developed with local stolen generations organisations must be established in WA and SA. South Australia is a high priority. This would recognise that higher proportion of adult stolen generations descendants in these jurisdictions who carry that extra burden of disadvantage. 4, to achieve sustainable and robust monitoring and accountability, a national accountability framework to monitor and report progress towards achieving better outcomes for stolen generation survivors and their descendants must be resourced. This would include reporting to Parliament. The report we proudly released today is the culmination of years of work, listening to and heeding the voices of stolen generation survivors. There is an urgent need to heal past wrongs for the well-being of those who were stolen, their descendants who have had their cultural authority and legacy compromised through what happened to their parents and their grandparents, for our communities who continue to hurt, and for Australia as a nation. Healing will restore dignity for those who have suffered and ease a burden that they had no say in having to carry. Healing recognises the centrality of self-determination and the strengths of our cultures in always being able to keep us safe and well. We must use this knowledge as a catalyst for redoubling our efforts to offer support, to honour them as heroes who keep courageously lending their voices to the plight over 25 years since the matters were formally raised via that inquiry. For stronger and freer, newer generations, we have the opportunity for national healing. The Make Healing Happen report and the AIHW report together provide the evidence of the need for reform, provides the solutions and the steps that governments can take to achieve real healing for the nation. The evidence and the testimonies comprise the truth. We must use it to ensure the effectiveness of each system, sector by sector and workforce by workforce. The effectiveness of applying equity approaches that gain equality in outcomes. New behaviours and approaches must be healing informed and must end trauma experiences for this large proportion of our families. Nationally consistent, fair and equitable redress for stolen generation survivors, their families and descendants will make healing happen. Tailored and targeted, trauma-aware and healing-informed services to meet the unique aged care, health, disability and housing needs of stolen generation survivors will make healing happen. Nationally consistent access to historical and contemporary records for stolen generation survivors and their families will make healing happen. A national healing strategy to address intergenerational trauma will make healing happen. That national accountability framework to monitor and report progress towards achieving better outcomes for this proportion of our population will make healing happen. A national centre for healing, incorporating a national memorial for stolen generations to be located right here on Ngunnawal Ngambri country in the capital. It will make healing happen. You are all needed to make healing happen. It's time to act. Thank you.
Fiona, thank you for such an important address and for choosing the National Press Club to launch both of these reports today. I want to just quickly draw Ian and Harry into the conversation and then we'll open to questions from our working journalists here today. Ian, let's bring your voice into this conversation. You yourself were removed at a very young age from your family and ended up living not too physically a greater distance apart from them. Can you tell us how that experience affected your life then as a child, but how it continues to affect your life today?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. For me, I was removed or separated from my family at 3 weeks of age. So at the time, it didn't have much of an effect at all. I was a baby. But growing up, you know that you're different. You know that you're not the same as everybody else that you go to school with or in the town you live. And I grew up in Yarrawonga on the Victoria-New South border. I was 1/3 of the Aboriginal population of Yarrawonga, the other two being 2 girls my mum and dad adopted a few years later. And that was out of a town of 3,200 people. So you know you're different. You grow up in an environment, and this is the 60s and 70s, and you grow up in an environment where you know nothing about being Aboriginal except what people tell you and what you see on the television. And it wasn't good. I grew up not knowing what I was supposed to be, but being told I should be grateful for what I've got. And I was grateful for it. The people who adopted me, they're my mum and dad. But in a world that tells you what you were born, says you should only aspire to be here and be grateful for it, that you should not want for more and should be happy with what you've got, that's what I grew up with. I had lots of good friends and lots of good mates. Don't get me wrong, Yarrawonga's a nice place, don't get me wrong. But it wasn't until I left that I found out where I was from. That question in your head as a child, all it takes is one person to say to you when you're a child, something that never leaves you. You were not wanted by your mother and you should be lucky to take what you've got. That never leaves you, ever. And when you start to find your journey, you start to look for where did I come from. That doubt is in your head the whole time. Will I be wanted? Will anybody care about me? That never leaves you every day of your life.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. When an Indigenous child is removed, in addition to the pain and the trauma, There's another thing that's happening there, isn't there, in a separation from country, from the physicality of a country to which someone belongs, and a loss of language in addition to that loss of identity. How has that affected first generation survivors, do you think, Anne?
I think what it does with first generation survivors is culture is the very centre of who we are as a people. We're attached to our traditional lands, but if you don't know you're on your traditional country, or if you don't know where it is, that very centrepiece of who you are, it's not there. You've got a vacuum that you try and form a life around. But that thing of walking in the footsteps of the people who came before you, not just your mother and your father, but the thousands of generations whose blood has been, who is integrated into this land, whose footprints are still buried beneath the surface. You're not connected to it. You don't know about it. In my own case, I grew up in Yarrawonga, but I'm from Shepparton. Shepparton's 5 kilometres from Yarrawonga, 50 kilometres from Yarrawonga. But I didn't know that until I left. I grew up on my own tribal lands, but I didn't know they were my country until I wasn't there. To find out that later, and then not have that cultural connection or that family or that all these things that happened, I didn't know about that until I wasn't there. So to try and backfill that as an adult, that's enormously difficult, that's enormously hard. And it's kind of every day you have that question, another question in your head, where do I fit in? How do I fit in? What's my place in my own Aboriginal community? Is there a place for me? And my community has been wonderful and great, and my family that I return to has been wonderful and great. But that doesn't take any of this away, because it's just with you from, well, in my case, from day 21, 3 weeks after I was born.
Harry, that seems a really fitting moment to bring in your family's story, because one of the things that these reports do really powerfully is not just draw out what is happening to survivors themselves, but also the resulting impact on family members, on their children and grandchildren. Your grandfather was removed, and tell us about how that not just affected his life, but how that's affected your whole family's life subsequently.
Thank you. Ian, as you mentioned, and that, the impact it has, let alone yourself as an adult trying to backtrack and do that. For myself, the impact it's had on myself and my family is I can sort of vaguely remember getting to a certain age, and like I knew my grandfather before I knew he was taken. So to have that love and that relationship, to know that, and then to getting to a certain age, and it's like, this happened to my pop, and like that's, my father's father, like that's not that long ago, and the fact that that trauma is like, it's from, that line's not too far away, it's still there, I still feel that, my brother, my sister, it's, the impact is just, like, still trying to understand what it means now for me. And it's had impacts across the board, from schooling to workplaces, the whole lot. It's it's hard to talk about it, and it's sort of, you're still living it, and as a younger person to sort of, okay, like I can't speak my native language right now, I can't do any of that, but we're still trying to, capture, where we're from. I know where I'm from, where I was born, and that, and my family, but to sort of grab onto, to know who we are and to maintain that culture, while at the same time, on the other hand, trying to, walk in the modern world at the same time. Like trying to still, there's barriers there, from the schooling, learning, and how our elders and that, literally still today looking after younger fellas, and it's the impacts are there. I've seen it.
It has a continuing profound impact.
It continues.
Yeah. I was really struck reading the reports about the picture of compounded disadvantage in these numbers and statistics that we already know more broadly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face big disparities on many of the kind of general indicators of health and well-being. But for survivors and for their children and grandchildren, those figures are really stark, aren't they? There's sort of much greater concentrations of poverty, of reliance on welfare, and some of those issues around the access and the contact with the justice system as well. How much progress do you feel we have made to this point, and how big is the task ahead here for the country? Fiona, do you want to lead us off on that?
I think as the report shows, there's great unmet need, and it was spoken about 25 years ago. The same common themes run right through, and in fact the Bringing Them Home report forewarned that if something wasn't done then, things would get worse, and they have. Children are still being removed, and we see the impact on descendants now. We see quite clearly that intergenerational trauma happens, and so not a lot has been done, and I wanted to take the time though to make sure that, well, me as a fairly younger person can honour that there are platforms that have been laid. There's strong leadership that started movements, and we all have to take up the reins and move them forward again. If things had been done in the way that was recommended back then, we wouldn't have to.
We're going to move to some questions from some of our working journalists now. So can we invite Amanda Kopp to ask the first question?
Hello, Amanda Kopp from National Radio News and the Community Radio Network. In the last week, we've seen the 4-year anniversary of the Uluru Statement being handed to the government come about. The government so far has said that there isn't enough support in the community for a referendum and changes to the Constitution, but there are calls at the moment for there to be more truth-telling and action on things in the Uluru Statement that don't involve constitutional change. So how do you think the government can act on the Uluru Statement right now rather than waiting for a referendum?
We know that how important truth-telling is to the journey of healing for stolen generation survivors and their families. We document stories with the permission of survivors. We know that people, stakeholders, the wider Australian community are leaning in and engaging with us because they're hearing stories, they're hearing the truth, and this report supports and validates. It shouldn't have to, but it does. It supports and validates the testimonies that have been provided so courageously and generously over many decades. But I think with the Uluru Statement, and I said this in the speech, is our survivors, the majority that we've worked with, were a part of those dialogues, and they do say that the absence of a voice, of a treaty, of truths, truth-telling, it has made the journey more difficult. And so there's support there, and it is big, but it's going to take something big.
Our next question is from Mark Kenny.
Thank you, Mark Kenny from the Press Club Board, also from ANU, and thank you very much for your comments so far, Ian. I found your comments particularly moving in relation to your experience, and I'm sure many people around the country will have. I suppose it underscores the difficulty of relating the multiple levels of damage done by removal of children and the intergenerational aspect of that, and getting the broader community to really understand the gravity of that. Can I also just take a moment to acknowledge, seeing as we are on national television, the organisers of the Gama Festival, who've once again had to cancel their festival this year. It's an important cultural festival for the country, and for Indigenous people, of course, and of course because of COVID it's been ruled unsafe to have that. So just an acknowledgement of the work and investment that would have gone into that, and what a sad story it is that that can't occur. Following on from the last question, I want to just talk about where we are with reconciliation. We see acknowledgements to country, welcomes to country. We see the Indigenous rounds in sporting codes, companies in the private sector leading some of this as well. I wonder if I could get a comment from all of you as to whether this represents genuine progress, or perhaps more the illusion of progress, perhaps more a branch off the main road of progress, so that it looks like we're doing things when the sorts of things you're talking about here today, the tough work, is perhaps not being done. There's a lot of gesturalism, if I can invent that word, rather than structuralism in some of the policy change needed.
If I might start with that one. I think you've actually hit the nail right on the head. One of the issues I think that we've forgotten with reconciliation is what is the fundamental purpose of it. Back when it was started, its very idea was a transformational one, to transform the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. That's the outcome it was trying to seek. It's the outcome it should be still trying to seek. But as with a lot of things we do in Australia, we've taken our eyes off the outcome and focused on the activity and the outputs. Reconciliation action plans. Hands up here whose organisation has a reconciliation action plan. We all got one? Right. So a lot of hands didn't go up then, but I'm going to take it that a lot have. The problem with them is people have focused so much on the activity and the outputs, they forgot what they're about. It's not about organisations achieving things, it's about the people in those organisations transforming their understanding and relationship with Aboriginal people, and Aboriginal people changing their relationship with non-Aboriginal people. So when they leave that organisation, that transformation goes with them, wherever they go, whatever they do. Instead, it's moved to, we've got a this rap, that rap, elevate rap, and I think where it shows where the eyes have gone off the ball, or the end of the game, or the outcome we're trying to achieve, two words: Rio Tinto. I don't think I have to say any more, but I'm going to. That showed, and it's not just them, there are others, but that showed that their focus was on regarding this as a stakeholder issue to be managed, that we had a scorecard to tick. But fundamentally, when they had to make the choice of embracing and understanding the importance of this place to the very core and identity of a people, they chose not to. And that's where reconciliation, and don't get me wrong, a lot has good have come from it, and there has been much transformation, but that's where I think we need to stop, take a breath and refocus. And that should help us get on the way to where we should be, Mark, which I hope will be in another decade, certainly another generation, that the transformation of all Australians will happen.
Can I ask as a corollary to that, Harry, as a young Wiradjuri man, how optimistic you feel about the state of progress in the country?
So, yeah, just to elaborate on what Ian said, so as a younger person, you know, I've worked for both private sector and public sector. I've seen all the raps, I've seen all the, you know, the good intentions people are doing in that, but yeah, for me, it's literally, you know, the way I see it is people are forgetting the human aspect of it. You know, it's not just, okay, organisations and governments can show and prove that, okay, we can put together this strategy, okay, we can put together this here, but it's forgetting that, you know, it's not so much statistics and numbers, it's good to have targets and whatnot, but more of it needs to be a lifestyle change. It needs to be a way of life. You know, we've got tens and tens of thousands of years of knowledge and ways of thinking and all of that, and we've, through the stolen generations and down to my generation and younger, it's sort of somewhere between that and here to try and still, you know, move forward into the 21st century with technology and all that sort of stuff. So, but people forget the human aspect of it, that, you know, you're dealing with humans, you know, and they're having human impacts. And, you know, yes, you can put together those raps and everything, but it comes down to the people in those organisations, in those businesses, in those sectors, from anyone, I guess, in IT to the health sector. You know, it's a part of your identity as well, living in Australia. And, you know, it's to the core of it, as you said, you know, it literally needs to come together and, you know, learn about each other, learn about your histories, and, you know, not so much, okay, it's a target, I've got KPIs against this. It's, you know, make it a way of life. It can be very confronting for people and organisations, and, you know, how do we do that? What does that look like? But remember that, you know, these impacts have had impacts on people, and, you know, it's going to continue to have an impact if that doesn't change, hence the need for urgent healing. You know, it's time to act. So if you want to put that, you know, down to, you know, what it means, what it looks like, it's, like I said, you know, like the Indigenous rounds, you know, there's people out there doing good things, good stuff, and but there's a long way to go. Like, you know, people can talk about lateral violence, but, you know, what about lateral healing? You know, what about lateral love? And, you know, to be able to change what that stuff looks like. And it's, you know, if you break it down in families, and, you know, one day when I have children and whatnot, you know, they're going to learn about who my grandfathers were and who my grandmother, and, you know, they're going to learn about what happened in the past, and, you know, then they're going to grow up. And I know that there's kids now still in out-of-home care, and they're going to, you know, oh, where am I from? Who am I? You know, that's still, look at the separation. It's not, you know, it's still there. It's still there. So, you know, I guess I could comment and say a lot more and keep going, but, you know, I always say this to people, and that relationship is only ever between two people, you know, whether it's an organisation or whether it's just person to person. And, you know, if that can be sort of unified and just be like, okay, yes, here's what's happened, here's, you know, you've got people and organisations out there with great capabilities and people, and, you know, you know, let's make healing happen. Let's, you know, I know it's simple, but it's complicated, but it's not. Like, yeah, but, yeah.
Beautifully put. Our next question today is from Sarah Collard from NITV.
Hi. Hello, thank you guys so much for your sharing your stories. I know it's not easy. My question is to the panel, but also Fiona. In terms of a national redress scheme, we know many stolen generation survivors are dying without seeing any compensation. And there's various legal actions with states and territories, but do we need some action and some urgency and some compassion from the federal government on this?
There's an opportunity there for the Australian government to lead on this, and I mentioned that particularly with the Commonwealth territories, but I guess what's important about a redress scheme and what the evidence in here points to is that it has to be fair, equitable, consistent, but informed by what we know is effective healing, and you know, we've got that now, and it would be silly for anyone to go ahead and design and implement anything without a process of co-development that includes the best practice in healing. We know from survivors and their stories that some of these reparations and redress schemes, they without that knowledge, without being informed by what effective healing looks like, they cause more harm. They cause more dysfunction in families. And so it gets back to your point, Ian, about what's the outcome we want here, and is this the best way of achieving it? And more often than not, and you look at out-of-home care, and you look at some of these other things, the answer's no.
Thank you.
Did any of the others want to add to that as well?
In terms of redress, I agree the states and territories do need to focus on it. So 3 of the jurisdictions have. My own state, Victoria, we're working on something, and I know that because I'm chairing the group working on it. I think, though, the issue you raised, and it was raised in the first question about the role of the Commonwealth in this, or the role of any governments. Do governments have a responsibility to follow, or do they have a responsibility to lead? Should they wait for the public to set the agenda, or are there occasions where leadership should be based not on a legal issue you want to get out of, but on a moral obligation you have to do as the government of the day, regardless of whatever colour you are, whatever party you are, to say this is where we need to go as a nation. The Uluru Statement, the Commonwealth leading the other states and territories around a redress package for stolen generations people. As I said, 3 of the states, soon to be 4, will have done a package. That doesn't mean they're all perfect. Does the Commonwealth have a role in not only getting the remainder up and going, but also to say to those others, you may need to revisit to lift up yours as well? I think, in answer to your question, yes, there is a role for the Commonwealth Government. It is not because it needs to get out of a legal technicality. It's because it should be providing a moral leadership, if nothing else, to say this group of Australians we can no longer not pay attention to. That's what the government should be doing.
And just quickly, who needs to provide that leadership? Is that expressly the Prime Minister or the federal government as a whole?
Well, the Prime Minister of the day, whoever it is, and we've had lots of Prime Ministers, lots and lots of Prime Ministers since 1997. Mm-hmm. So it's not just this Prime Minister, but it's everyone since 97. But Scott Morrison is the Prime Minister now. He has the chance to put his stamp on the pages of Australian history by saying, I did this thing because we hadn't done it before.
Our next question is from Dan Forshaw.
Ewan, good afternoon. Thank you so very much for that address this afternoon and for this incredible report which outlines clearly a problem that we haven't been talking about for so long. I want to thank Harry and Ian in particular for those really heartfelt stories. It is really challenging to talk on a national stage about something so personal, but to Fiona for the work you're doing around intergenerational healing and bringing the nation along. Can I just say a huge thank you. I always feel like I walk away having learnt so much from talking to you. Misha, thank you very much. There's 3 panellists, so I thought I might have a question for each if that was okay.
Sure, yes. Look, the Sabra Lane rule is out the window.
That's right. Fiona, to start with, it strikes me that hearts and mind policy is changed in Australia by community and corporations. They're the ones that have led the charge on same-sex marriage, leading the charge on climate change as well. What do you say to Australians who might be listening and watching today, feeling as though they're nervous about delving into this conversation, that they're worried about making a mistake and getting it wrong? Ian, you brought up Rio Tinto. Would it have made a difference if there were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the board? And should that happen now? And do you think that that's something that corporate boards in Australia need to think about, is who they have around the table? And Harry, we just heard from Sarah Collard, an incredible young Indigenous journalist. How important is it to see and hear the voices of First Nations people across the media spectrum?
Okay.
It's not the things I was thinking about.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your kind words too, and always being open to our discussions. I appreciate that. I've forgotten the question.
About people,
yeah,
the community.
The community, that's right. Taking this information to the community, mobilising important people in community. What we say as the Healing Foundation to anyone leaning in, those stakeholders that lean in, is that healing isn't in the too hard basket anymore. Take it out of there. You know what the stats are now. You know the impact and the level of the extent of inequity and inequality. You can take equity approaches. You can change behaviours, and people are doing this. hospitals are doing this. They're saying it's racist of us to not complete the care for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person that comes in here because we know how much they suffer compared to the rest of the community. And they change their behaviour. They make sure that that person doesn't leave without receiving the care that they need. So that's just one example. So that evidence base I talked about in my speech, we're just going to keep building that up, keep building up all the options. But what's important is that you do get the right people around the table, and I'm proud of the Healing Foundation because we have a knack for that. We make sure that we have good people in the room, to borrow from my brother, to talk about the right thing at the right time and the right way forward. It's really important. And to say something else that my brother says all the time, and when you talk about incremental change, he says, "No more now, no more now." It's time to get the big changes happening, and we know it can happen now. There's no one who can say, "I don't know how to do that. I'm too scared to do that." The survivors are leading the movement. They're creating change all the time. They didn't wait for this to come out. They already did those fact sheets for those professional bodies. So, yeah, that's what I would say to them.
So, corporate governance. So I did a little bit of this at the AICD conference earlier this year, if you want to Google that and have a look. It was a fundamental issue of what do Aboriginal people bring to boards? Too often we are looked at as, let's have an Aboriginal person on our board. Why? Because we want to have diversity. That's not how you think about it. What you should be thinking of, what boards don't understand, public and private entities don't understand, is they lack something. We've had 40 years of corporations being driven by shareholder value and profit maximisation, and they forgot about their social licence to operate, their contract with the society in which they live, and they just don't know how to do it. Would it have made a difference having an Aboriginal person on the board of Rio Tinto? Yes, it would have, because that person would have said we have to act with integrity in the country of the people that 90% of our business happens in, the traditional lands of the people of Western Australia. So it wouldn't have happened. Now, my challenge to boards, to corporations, public and private on this country, is you need to have Aboriginal people on your boards because they will give you what you lack now. My people, our people, if there is one group of people who conceptually understand community over self, your contribution rather than your self-interest as an individual or a corporation, it's us. None of us are skilled tax accountants. None of us might be experts at governance, but we do know what our social contract to the society we live in is, because that's how our community operates. That's what our culture is about. So, corporate Australia, I throw on you the challenge, pick it up and do something about it.
Now, we are running really tight of time, and I'm conscious that we have a fabulous Canberra Grammar student waiting in the wings to ask a question. So, Harry, did you want a 30-second riff quickly?
Cool. Thank you. Your question, in response to your question about giving younger people a voice and that, I think it's very important too, because there's going to be learnings from that, and there's going to be so I lost my train of thought. So the importance of having young people, a voice is to be able to, they've got needs and wants, and they look to be able to, go to their parents and their grandparents for guidance and that. And the reason why it's important, so to give an example of that, so for myself, so my grandfather, he passed away, and so for me that was, to put it in perspective, that was like a book or a library of knowledge gone that, I could never go to for reference or refer to, or, that's how hard and real my impact and that impact is. So the importance of, giving younger people that voice to be able to stand up and, hear how they feel, because the solutions are within those young people, they'll, if it's done right, by the right people with the right support. So anything can be done, but with the right support. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our last question today is from Canberra Grammar student, Camilla Roy, represent Kai Moggridge.
My name is Kai Moggridge and I'm a Camilla man. I'm one of the Podmore scholarship holders at Canberra Grammar School, and my question for you today is, do you believe the second stolen generation is because of socio-economic disadvantage and is circumstantial, or because of the lack of movement in government policy?
Do I believe it's the second stolen generation? Probably not in the intent that there is separation happening now, but certainly the consequence can be exactly the same. Kai, that's a really good question. My generation, we were taken simply because of what we were born. People who are being removed now, children now, there is often, or arguably, reasons behind it beyond just simply because of what you were born. But the consequence can be the same. If they do not remain in contact with their family, if they do not stay well connected with their culture, if they don't feel they have a place to belong and not encouraged to have a place to belong, then the consequence will be the same. And the Press Club, in whatever shape or form it will have in another 40 years, will be hosting a lunch of the successor to the Healing Foundation and the successor to Fiona's brilliant work, launching another report, Make Healing Happen Part 3. We don't want that. So that's a really good question to ask, and I'm glad you did, and it's something for all of us to think about.
Such a powerful note on which to conclude our discussion today. Would you please join me, all of you, in thanking... One question, please. We've just hit the broadcast thing, but we do encourage questions of our panellists after we jump off the air. So would you please thank Fiona Cornforth, Ian Hamm and Harry Williams. Thank you.